So hello everyone, I'm Emily Bick. I am a former Rainbow Research and Development Manager as of this past August, and currently an entomology PhD student at University of California, Davis, focusing on integrated pest management. A little bit about me, I graduated in 2013 from Yale University, and then after that got board certified as an entomologist by the Entomological Society of America. I'm excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics, relating biology to management. And today we'll be focusing specifically on Colorado scale insects. So just a little bit about the intended outcomes of today. I want everyone to leave here with a basic understanding of scale insects, their biology, the major groups of scales, what major families we work with, and why those different families' morphology matters so much in terms of management. I do want to give everyone sort of the basic tools to assess their own scale insect problems for management plans. However, I will be focusing on 3 different protocols: the European elm scale, the pine needle scale, and the oystershell scale, which I know are particularly problematic here in Colorado. So what are scales? Well, they don't really look like insects, do they? Take a look at the photo on the right. You see that sort of hard circular bubble that's up on a leaf that these other ants are tending to? Well, those are scale insects. And they are actually hugely important to multiple ecosystems, though they don't really look like insects. But I do want to put these pest problems into some context here. If you take a look at that ancient photograph, or an ancient picture up on the top right, you'll see a person pulling scale insects off of a prickly pear cactus. And she's actually doing that so that they can be crushed down and extracted for red dye. In fact, scale insects were the first natural coloring agent for red that the South American people had. They're found on prickly pear cactuses, as depicted in this picture, and they have been in use for thousands of years as dye. In fact, when the Europeans came over to conquer the Americas, one of the major imports that they brought back was this red dye, which people did not have access to before. Today, they're actually still in use in cosmetics and foodstuff, including in 2012, Starbucks got in trouble for using what this article refers to as beetle extract as a main ingredient for their red food coloring dye. However, it wasn't really beetles, was it? What are scale insects? Well, scales, like all insects, fall into the kingdom Animalia. They're arthropods, which means that they have jointed legs. They fall into class Insecta, which are defined by 3 pairs of legs, 6 legs total, and 2 sets of wings. However, these insects have retroactively lost their wings, mostly. They fall into the order of hemipterans, which means that they are true bugs. So they're superorder and they're superfamily of Coccidae. And hemiptera actually have a few major groups of insects, and you might recognize these other ones as tree pests as well. Leafhoppers, mealybugs, tree bugs, and cicadas fall into the order Hemiptera in the class Hemiptera as well. But aphids, adelgids, whiteflies, and Coccidae, which are scale insects, fall into sort of the super category of Homoptera. And these are very important because the type of insecticides that are effective at targeting this order of hemipterans may be effective at targeting some of these other insect pests. We'll get into that in a little bit. So what are scale insects? Well, there are actually 48 different families of scale insects, but really we only care about 2 of them. We care about the soft scales, seen on the left. They're more bulbous. They can pass what some arborists call the squish test to see if they're dead or alive. And we care about the armored scales on the right. Those are two distinct families. Armored scales are a little bit smaller than the soft scales, and they stick on even after they die. So specifically, I want to talk about what defining features scale insects have. In the order Hemipterans, scale insects are defined by the same order features as other hemipterans by having piercing, sucking mouthparts. They literally stick their tube of mouthparts straight into a plant and either tap a cell individually or tap the vascular bundle completely. And this piercing mouthpart acts as a straw for their nutrients. The adult females are highly modified. In fact, the entire scale insects are highly modified. Looking to the right, before I was an entomologist, I certainly would not have recognized that as an insect. The adult females may lack wings, legs, and even segmentation, which is one of the defining features of insects. In fact, your client might not even recognize these as insects. I would say probably would not recognize these as insects. They might say, I have this weird growth on my tree. You should immediately start thinking, well, is it a scale insect? And as I noted before, scale insects can fall into soft scales or armored scales. But what's really their impact on trees and on plants? Well, there's aesthetic appeal, which is sort of the speckling that we see. If it's really just aesthetic damage, we have to ask ourselves, do we treat or do we not treat? There's a decrease in photosynthetic activity. This much damage to a plant, once you pass the threshold, is actually going to impact its ability to collect energy, and that's going to impact your plant's susceptibility to other types of diseases. Scale insects can actually transmit pathogens, so that's a huge issue if scales are going around and spreading a virus that is potentially deathly to your tree. And there's economic loss. Scale insects en masse, or a virus that's transmitted by scale insects, can cause damage, including severe dieback or even death of tree. And finally, there's honeydew. Now, honeydew is one of those things that people are not exactly sure if they really impact people's lives. Honeydew is more of a nuisance, as most people say. You can see it over here on the left picture where my mouse is pointing. Those little specks are the shiny specks of honeydew that the scale insects leave behind. And after the honeydew comes, sooty mold actually comes through and colonizes the entire leaf. Sooty mold is a huge issue because if honeydew lands off your plant and onto your roof, your car, your lawn furniture, it is near impossible to get off. It is very, very difficult to clean. So that nuisance is actually potentially an economic damage. Honeydew also attracts a whole range of other insects. Since it's a high sugar content, it will attract wasps, bees, and ants. And that can be problematic if someone has a child that's allergic. So let's take a look at what makes soft scales different than armored scales. Soft scales are up to 1/4 inch wide. They're smooth or cottony. They don't have a shell like armored scales. You can take a look at the smooth picture on the left and the cottony picture on the right. I believe the top picture is smooth. They're round, or mostly round. They feed directly on phloem sap, which means they tap into the vascular system, the vascular bundle of a plant, and allow the sap to stream through them as they collect only a small portion of the nutrients out of the sap. That's what creates honeydew. It's actually the waste of the plant, of the insect, streaming the plant's vascular system through it. However, they do lay hundreds to thousands of eggs. So these are high reproducers. Each female will, once a year, and only once a year, lay sometimes thousands of new scale insects. But the flip side is they only have one generation per year, which means that you only have to target one particular time when those larvae and nymphs, when those nymphs are susceptible. Also, they overwinter as nymphs. And this biology should allow us to gain some insight into what makes these insects susceptible for when we need to treat them. Now, over here, I want to explain a little bit of what happens in a leaf. This slide is courtesy of Dr. Joe Boggs of the Ohio State University. It depicts a typical leaf cross-section with a cuticle, an upper epidermis, the palisade mesophyll layer, the spongy mesophyll layer, and those two layers are where photosynthesis generally happens, the lower epidermis. And then on the right, you can take a look at the vascular bundle defined by the xylem and the phloem. Well, there's our scale insect coming along for the ride. The scale insect literally inserts his or her piercing sucking mouth part, the stylet, directly into the phloem bundle, as we see in this image. And the damaged cells, which are the darkened cells over here, die, producing some major leaf symptoms. And the main question is, or the main damage is a withdrawal of a large quantity of liquids. So all of the energy coming to and from that leaf is being withdrawn. So instead of speckling, we'll see a whole leaf yellowing. That's a pretty major sign. When there's no speckling and there's some leaf yellowing, that the scale insect is a soft scale. And these scales also present a waste disposal problem, which, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the scale voids the waste through the form of sticky honeydew. And as we noted before, the sticky honeydew settles on the leaves, and very quickly, laxity mold comes and colonizes the leaf. Now, this is a little bit different than hard scales or armored scales. It's a different family, but still one out of many, or two out of many families. These are quite a bit smaller, so these might be harder to see. They're all less than 1/8 an inch long. They have a waxy, hard shell, which is why they're called hard or armored scales, which means that contact pesticides will not work if that shell has been developed. They don't produce honeydew, and we'll explain a little bit about why in a second. And most life stages are not mobile, which means once they insert their stylet, they're there to stick. They're there for life. And each scale in female lays less than 100 eggs. So that's less eggs and sort of a lower reproductive rate than the soft scales. However, that is counterbalanced by having several generations per year, which means that instead of targeting, spraying, or injecting a pesticide once, you might need to do it multiple times. And since these insects overwinter as nymphs and adults, we really need to target the nymphal stage, which means that multiple treatments will be needed to lower the infestation level of armored scales. So here's our leaf cross-section again, and those are our scales. And they insert their stylets actually directly into the palisade and the mesophyll, physically into the plant cells. This direct damage causes the plants, those cells and the cells that they're puncturing through to die, which produces the speckling leaf symptoms that we see over here. Now, we really need to take a look at management. Do we treat or do we not treat? So many scales are secondary pests, which means treating the scale issue may not actually save the tree. They're basically coming in after the trees are already majorly compromised. So as secondary pests, we really need to figure out what's actually wrong with the tree before we go in and treat, because treating for scales won't solve the tree's whole problem. Some are just aesthetic pests. Some just look bad. So if your homeowner insists that he or she really wants to treat the tree, that's when you treat it. But I would push back a little bit, saying that treatment may not be necessary for just aesthetic pests. Some come in light infestations at early years. If there's just a very low infestation of scale insects, that's normal. Scales are part of an ecosystem, and light infestations do not need to be addressed necessarily. However, on the flip side, heavy infestations can cause some major plant damage. As we look to the right over here, that speckling is due to armored scales, as we talked about before. And that much speckling across the board may compromise the entire tree. In fact, it may stunt the tree. It definitely causes chlorosis on the leaves, which is yellowing of the leaves, where the leaves are not producing or not photosynthesizing at the proper rate. It would absolutely reduce the vigor of the tree and the health of the tree, which makes it more susceptible. Reduced vigor makes the tree more susceptible to other infestations and other pests, including other secondary pests, as the case may be. And it may even cause dieback. And then, of course, there's a city mold problem, which is unsightly, a definite nuisance, and hard to manage. Also, keep in mind that some pathogens are spread by insects, but if the pathogen is directly spread by the insect, treating it with a systemic will not be effective, because by the time the insect inserts its mouth parts into the tree, it's already transmitting whatever the pathogen is. So we might need to look at target sprays, contact sprays, or horticultural oil to target that particular pest. So what goes into product choice? And I think a lot of it has to do with application timing factors. When you choose a product, you have to take a look at, will it even work on this class of insects? Will it work on the family of insects? Some will and some won't. Some that work on closely related species will get detoxified in this target species. After we choose the product choice, we can take a look at how will it move through the tree if it's systemic. If the insecticide moves through the tree systemically and it's a large molecule like imidacloprid or acephate, then it will actually get stuck and not translocate, or sorry, not spread throughout the leaf. So it will only impact soft scales and not hard scales. We have to look at target life stages. In terms of scales, the target life stage to hit is their nymphal stage, or their crawlers, when they're still up and moving. And when their shell or external barrier hasn't fully developed. So will the insecticide move through the tree and reach that target stage? So this might be a timing issue. Will the scale actually come in contact to the insecticide? If we use a systemic insecticide and we're trying to target an arbored scale, it may never come in contact to an insecticide that has a large molecule, since it may not go through the tree in the way that we expect. And then what's the longevity of the product in the tree? The scale might not come into contact with the insecticide because new scales hatch over the course of likely a month or a couple of weeks, multiple times in a season if it's an armored scale. So if this is the case and the insecticide only lasts and we treat 2 weeks before the scale emerges, then it might not actually hit the tree at the right time. So all of these factors go straight into product choice. So now I want to take a look at different control strategies. The first one I want to talk about is sort of the traditional contact insecticide. There's a person spraying using a trunk and limb spray. He or she may be using horticultural oil, which is highly selective. Essentially, it smothers the overwintering insects, but keep in mind it only impacts the crawlers or the nymphal stages. Also, this should be done in March or November, so sort of the fall or spring time period. Some fallbacks with the trunk and limb spray are we will never get complete coverage of a tree. They're just nooks and crannies that we will not be able to coat completely. And with that, we will always have some scale insects surviving at the end. Another trunk and limb spray, which has the same fallback, is Tangard. Tangard, instead of smothering the insect, is actually a contact insecticide, which means as soon as it hits a susceptible insect, it will kill on target. So by that regard, it is less selective because it will kill everything on the tree that's susceptible to permethrin. This does only have a 2-week residual, so if the insects are coming out over a 4-week period, we need to spray Tangard more than once. And also only the crawlers are susceptible, so spray only when the crawlers are actually present. Then the second control strategy is a systemic insecticide. I'm going to be talking about dinotefron, which is Rainbow Tree Care's Transtek product, imidacloprid, which is RTSA's Zytec product, and acephate, which is RTSA's Lepidosaphes product. Transtek can be either soil applied or bark applied. It's comparable to Safari. Transtek has a fairly quick uptake period where it can be uptaken within 1 to 2 weeks. It should be applied about 2 weeks prior to the season of crawlers being available. The bark spray, however, is much quicker. It's a 2 to 3 day uptake. So when we take a look at the bark spray, that's sort of an instantaneous application. And we want to only spray when the crawlers are present, only spray when the susceptible life stage is available to be targeted. With both of these things, having done some bark sprays and some soil applications, it is definitely less labor than doing a full trunk and limb spray. However, it's also less selective, which means that anything in the tree or on the bark of the tree, if we're doing a bark spray, will be targeted, which is good or bad, depending on what your client's needs are. And this actually is a 4 to 6 month activity. So we can usually apply Transtek once at the beginning of the season, right when the crawlers are starting, and it will last the entire season, but not into the next year. Imidacloprid can be soil applied or tree injected with our Zytec infusible product. The soil applied takes 4 to 6 weeks for uptake, which means that we need to start applying the soil Zytec about 4 weeks prior to the season starting. Alternatively, an injection is a near instantaneous uptake, and at which point we apply the injection at crawler onset. Once again, I believe that these two options have less labor associated with them, but also have season-long activity, which means that you can apply right at the beginning of the season, and you'll be completely fine for the entire season. They're also less selective, which I talked about before. And then there's acephate, which is our Lepidosaphes product. Acephate can be soil applied. It takes 1 to 2 weeks for uptake, so fairly quick uptake. Just to be on the safe side, you should apply about 2 weeks prior to the season starting. A tree injection has almost immediate uptake, which means that we should apply about 1 week prior to the crawlers moving in the tree. Both of these are less labor. However, they are also, being systemic insecticides, less selective. And they do have about only a 30-day activity. So this is an instantaneous knockdown type product. When we're taking a look at application timing for any of these, we really need to think about when the crawlers are present. Since with scale insects, timing is everything. Timing is totally, totally crucial. With Transtek, as late as 1 to 2 weeks prior to crawlers is when we can start applying Transtek as a soil, or as a bark spray 1 to 2 days prior to crawlers appearing. We can apply much sooner though, since this is a systemic insecticide that has a season-long duration. And Transtek can also serve as a just-in-time solution. Zytec, however, cannot. It has a much longer uptake period. However, it does last the full year. So it's longer to go into the plant. However, it lasts much longer within the plant. In horticultural oil, we really need to take a look at spraying right in the fall and right in the spring. And I have some specifics on when to apply in a little bit. For 10 guard, we need to apply right at crawler emergence, and we may need multiple sprays since 10 guard only has a 14-day residual. And then Lepidosaphes, we can soil apply 1 to 2 weeks prior, but this thing only has a 30-day duration. So even though it goes into the tree fairly quickly, it only lasts for 30 days. And this is just a graph explaining a little bit about how quickly Transtek versus Zytec entered the tree. the bars are not associated, they're just nanograms of active ingredient in grams per leaf tissue. And the amounts don't reflect how much is necessary to actually impact a scale insect. However, you can see from this graph that Transect enters in and then leaves the tree at a much faster rate than Zytec does. So for control strategies, when we get called to a site, we hear, okay, I've got a scale insect problem. We have to very quickly determine if it's an armored scale or if it's a soft scale. Soft scales have a whole range of solutions that can be applied, with timing being crucial. You can use horticultural oil or hort oil plus Tengard as a spray. We can use a soil applied Zytec, Transect, or Lepidosaphes, or a bark spray of Transect, or even a tree injection of Zytec or Lepidosaphes. For armored scales, though, you are pretty limited to just the hort oil plus Tengard, which is the permethrin product, or a soil or bark spray of Transect. And that's because of the place that the armored scales feed. Since the armored scales feed intracellularly, they need something that actually will translocate to that cell versus just move through the vascular bundle. Versus all the rest of the systemic insecticides will travel nicely through the tree's vascular system. Transect has a much smaller molecule, which means it's actually able to spread around the leaf once it gets there. So now I'm looking at the Colorado-specific scales. On our soft scale side, we have European elm scale. I actually went out and did a couple trials with Colorado State entomologist Whitney Cranshaw on European elm scale. We also have armored scales, pine needle scale, and oystershell scale. I want to go over these protocols. So this is European elm scale. You can see on the pictures on the right, they like to cluster around branch nodes. The crawlers are bright yellow and very, very tiny, so very hard to see. So we do have to go and do some sampling to figure out exactly when the crawlers are present. European elm scales sort of have a striped look with an outside ring of white and an inside circle or oval of brownish to reddish. They feed exclusively on elms, but mainly on American elms. And the feeding damage is really due to the fact that these guys are honeydew producers. They cause some major leaf yellowing and some leaf drop, and also some potential branch dieback. In Denver, these insects have actually started overwhelming the trees, and we've started to see some tree dieback as well. So these are your solutions for European elm scale. The crawlers emerge between June and August. So right when the crawlers emerge, we can immediately spray with Tengard and spray multiple times throughout that season, probably twice or 3 times, to knock down that crawler stage immediately. Alternatively, we could do a soil application or a bark application of Transect. And the Transect, we do it a little bit before the crawlers are present, or the bark application you can do all the way through towards the end of when the crawlers are available. We can do a soil application or a tree injection with Lepidosaphes, which is the acephate product. You can do the soil application a little bit before, so right at the start of June, or right about a week into when the crawlers are present. Or you can do a tree injection, which is instantaneous, and you can do it all the way through the end of when the crawlers are available. So into almost the first week of July, you can use Lepidosaphes. So with Zytec, it's a little bit different. We have a much greater range of treatment. However, this does take some planning of when to treat, since this product can take 4 to 6 weeks to actually get into the tree. So all the way from mid-March to sort of end of May, beginning of June, beginning of May, that's when we really need to start treating with Zytec for this year's pest. Alternatively, if we're taking a look at next year's pest, since Zytec does last in the soil or does last in the tree for a year, for a full season, you can treat sort of end of July all the way through and including end of October for next season's crawlers. And then you can also use horticultural oil in the November to December time frame, the February to March time frame. And on the November to December time frame, we need to make sure that we have 48 hours of continuous temperature below freezing, so the insects have stopped moving. And the actual day needs to be a little bit warmer for when to treat with hort oil. It needs to be about 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit per day. And then on the flip side, we need to treat in February to March before leaf bud break, and about 48 hours of continuous temperature below freezing, and then right as that temperature hops up to 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit per day. For pine needle scale, these are a little bit harder to see. If you take a look at the top picture on the right over here, you'll see these are tiny insects that really might be mistaken as just something wrong with the needles. They look like a growth, fungal growth even, on the needles. Since these things aren't really moving around, they stay hooked in when they die. We're really not, it's very, very difficult to detect. Pine needle scales affect mungo and Scotch pines, but Scotch pine trees are preferred. They cause some major feeding damage in terms of needle chlorosis, in terms of premature needle drop. You'll start to see this unsightly white flecks all over the needles, and eventually reduce plant vitality. The crawlers, as you can see over here, are also bright yellow, so in stark contrast. But look at how small the adults are. These things are very hard to see. Now, since pine needle scale is a little bit, is an armored scale, it's a little bit trickier to treat. Zytec and Lepidosaphes likely will not work for pine needle scale. So what we can do is do a direct treatment as soon as the crawlers are present, and likely multiple times over the season. We can treat with Tangard, or we can treat with Transect right when the crawlers are present at the beginning of the season. Alternatively, you can spray horticultural oil using the same spraying techniques as I described, or spraying conditions as I described in the slide before. Now I have a study that we did on Transect soil applied at the 3.4 grams per inch in diameter, which is about 10 quarts per tree of Transect. And we treated once and saw some immediate control in terms of 90.75% mortality in the nymphs versus only 8.5% in the control. And then a little bit later, a couple of weeks later, we saw 100% mortality of the adults because adults didn't develop versus 126.5 on average adults present. So Transect is a very effective treatment for pine needle scale. Then there's Oystershell scale. This is a polyphagous insect, which means it eats multiple species. It attacks multiple species. This includes aspen, ash, coneaster, poplar, willow, and lilac. It is very hard to see. It blends in very well. It hits mostly the larger branches in the trunks. You can see it on the right. It does really look like an oyster shell. Also, the crawlers are once again bright yellow, but very tiny, so very difficult to see. This will cause some major limb dieback and potentially complete plant mortality if it's not controlled. Additionally, all of the holes that it is poking through the bark will increase the plant susceptibility to pathogens. So now I do want to talk a little bit about treatment failure. What will cause this? I know we've all experienced instances where our prescribed treatments don't work, or don't work as well as we think they should be working. When this is the case, we really need to take a look at and see why this is happening so that we can fix it in the future and so that we can minimize treatment failure from happening again. So this could be a life cycle issue. This could be that the pesticide was not synchronized with the life cycle, so that the pesticide was applied maybe too early or too late, and it didn't hit the crawler stage, or it only hit part of the crawler stage. It could be a systemic versus a contact problem. If it's a contact pesticide and you applied it at the right time, it could be just a completely coverage issue. Or since contact pesticides like Tengard only last 2 weeks, it could have been only applied once. If it's a systemic pesticide, however, the systemic could have been applied after the crawlers were present, or if you applied dinotefron, like a Transfect or a Safari product, this really would not work if it's applied for the season before this pest is a problem. Could be the population of insects has already reached a major establishment point, which means that if this is the case and your tree is in decline, we may actually need multiple years of treatment to get effective results. I talked a little bit about spray coverage before, but with sprays it's very difficult, in fact I would say near impossible, to get complete coverage of all those nooks and crannies of the tree, which really means that we need to try and get full spray coverage, but likely combine sprays or do incorporate sprays multiple times or as an integrated pest management strategy into our treatment plan instead of completely relying on a single spray for scale insects. It could be we chose the wrong pesticide. If we tried to use an imidacloprid like Zytec or an acephate like Lepidosaphes on hard insects, on hard scale insects, it wouldn't be effective at all. And then finally, we've all had this happen to us. There are some major weather concerns where we spray and the spray is washed off when it rains immediately. Or if there's an irregular weather effect, like a storm that's in the middle of the summer, or it cools down too quickly or warms up too early, then weather could just completely mess up the effects of timing for the treatment. And it will be much less predictable. And then I do have to say that dinotefron, though a great tool and a great systemic treatment, is not effective against obscure scale, which we have 2 trials showing that, and also not effective against white peach scale, which there's 1 trial showing. So overall, for recommendations, try to do crawler stage sprays as much as possible for those 2 insects. Thank you so much. I'm Emily Bick. Please feel free to contact me at enbick@ucdavis.edu, or the staff at Rainbow Tree Care is always great. Feel free to contact them at info@treecarescience.com or directly at the Solution Center. Thanks so much.